Okay, hi. Before I start, I would like to thank the organizers for putting together this workshop. Any opportunity to discuss Singapore's urban futures amidst wider globalizing dynamics is always timely and welcome. In this short presentation, I would like to focus on how Singapore actors have come to mobilize urban policy expertise and knowledge in foreign territories as a way of managing different urban futures, and how these processes unfold amidst wider political and economic conditions of uncertainty and risk. These mobilizations beyond Singapore are couched in what is popularly known as the Singapore model, as we had a panel discussion about it just now. And it refers to the perception of Singapore as an international model of growth and urban livability, most recently in the realms of sustainable urbanism. And I use the case of the Sino-Singapore Tianjin Eco-City, an intergovernmental urban mega project undertaken by the Singapore and Chinese governments, as a window to illustrate these wider interrelationships between the circulations of urban policy expertise and the negotiation of Singapore's urban futures. This is based on several months of fieldwork that I did in Tianjin and Singapore from 2014 to 2015. And as with many emergent eco and smart cities, the Tianjin Eco-City, for me, resonates with wider notions of new built cities and so-called urban utopias that have been designed precisely in response to existing problems of urban growth, however discursively problems may be defined. These are envisioned as spacious settings where the future can be rehearsed, experimented with, and presumably prepared for. So I'm guessing that most people here have never visited the Eco-City, so here's a quick introduction. It's an urban mega project that was undertaken jointly by the Singapore and Chinese governments in 2008, and it's expected to be completed in 2020. The aim was for both governments to create what they think will be a socially harmonious, environmentally friendly, and resource-conserving city in the Tianjin Binhai New area, one of China's fastest developing city regions in the northeast, an hour away from Beijing by high-speed train. In this eco-city, a mix of government agencies and companies converged to develop and execute expertise related to their different ideals of urban sustainability. So previously, before the eco-city was constructed, there was a salt marsh, which has now been transformed into a high-end urban development zone. The engineering of wetland and salt marsh into a steel and glass eco-city has, at its core, the modern ideal of the transformation of nature effected by science and technology. At the edges of the eco-city, however, the remains of the salt marsh are still visible. Currently, the Tianjin Eco-City is considered one of the most developed eco-cities around the world, if not the most developed, largely because most other eco-city plans have never come to fruition beyond the drawing board or policy plans. But apart from the main startup area, construction sites remain common. So the startup area is also dotted with various so-called eco-innovations such as solar lamps and very high-tech recycling bins. And the Eco-City represents a spacious zone to experiment with public housing policies. Nowhere else in China does public housing exist, and if considered successful, the results will be scaled up beyond the Eco-City to other sites of China. So for me, the Tianjin Eco-City can be framed as an extraterritorial strategy. I borrow the term extraterritoriality from the geographer Nick Phelps, and it seeks to capture how nation-states mobilize different elements of globalization to exert their powers beyond the boundaries of the state. In the process, they further their own political and economic interests. The extraterritorial elements of state power are associated with soft geopolitical and economic benefits. And in Singapore's case, these have allowed the city-state to generate economic and technological hinterlands abroad to support its domestic economy. So as a prospective platform for Singapore firms to go abroad, the development of the Tianjin Eco-City sits squarely in the Singapore state's regionalization agenda of supporting local firms and extending their corporate networks overseas. It is tied to a legacy of overseas industrial parks that constitute Singapore's wider economy, but it is also attuned to the emergent strategy of exporting the Singapore model and the Singapore state's self-professed urban solutions abroad to extend and consolidate their geopolitical and corporate networks beyond Singapore. So in view of the idea of urban futures, I'm using the Eco-City as a window to briefly illustrate how Singapore's state elites wrestle with different futures of Singapore on foreign ground. So it's quite easy to view the Tianjin Eco-City as just another eco-city driven exclusively by and for corporate interests. But I would argue that it needs to be historically contextualized as part of a foreign policy strategy crafted in consideration of Singapore's geopolitical position as a small, post-colonial city-state in Pacific Asia. This is the positionality that shapes how Singapore has come to interact with external actors, especially the emerging big powers in Asia, namely China and India, in addition to its existing relationships with the US. Talking to Singapore state actors involved in the project continually surfaced historical doctrines and the rhetoric of relevance and survival of the developmental state. These discourses inevitably filter into the interactions and relationships that frame the Tianjin Eco-City. More than once, I was told that this is a purely political project to continue engaging the Chinese, and if Singapore is relevant, then we continue to have a reason to exist. So the Eco-City is leveraged by the Singapore state as a way to maintain regular contact and presumably favorable relationships with Chinese government officials. And as such, it can be viewed as an attempt to secure its geopolitical futures with rising powers in Asia. However, this is also a strategy that is attuned to wider global currents where the discourse of sustainability has increasingly permeated national and international policy agendas worldwide, as well as a growing preoccupation with the mobility of knowledge, where so-called best practices can be assumed to be replicable across space and time. Hence, the idea that what is known as the Singapore model can be mobilized in a city region in northeast China. So the organizational structure of the project features both Singapore and Chinese government officials of different rankings. For the Singapore officials, it's a way for them to continually engage the Chinese and facilitate regular meetings. And it functions as an institutional vehicle for Singapore state actors to move through different levels of Chinese government as they cultivate relationships with what they think, with the people they think will be promising and eventually rise through the ranks to occupy key positions in the central government. In this sense, sustainability expertise is the medium through which diplomatic relationships are made and remade in vision of the geopolitical futures. On a broader level, the Eco-City can also be considered as a demonstrative political platform for both countries to project to wider international audiences their efforts at addressing global issues, in this case, climate change. So it's geopolitical posturing, if you will, and Singapore's doctrine of relevance applies not just to China, but also to the rest of the world. And in this sense, the Tianjin Eco-City is not merely a China-Singapore foreign policy, but it's also a broader international one, where Singapore seeks to carve its place in the world from the setting of a Chinese city region. And I would like to close this section by considering the multi-scalar geopolitics of cooperation and conflict of the project. The Eco-City was originally planned as a standalone 30 km square site with its own transportation system, but its development has been complicated and progressively stalled by different levels of Chinese government that have tried to integrate the Eco-City into wider regional configurations that were never part of the original plan. These conflicts over the transport system have resulted in the drawing and redrawing of the Eco-City's boundaries, as well as the subsequent departure of several top regional property developers on the project, which has resulted in further stalling. So after Singapore left the Suzhou Industrial Park project in the 1990s, which is considered the predecessor of the Tianjin Eco-City, a popular opinion expressed highlighted the difficulties of a city-state in dealing with multiple levels of government in a foreign country. So quite possibly, these same complications are resurfacing in the Tianjin Eco-City. And the Eco-City is also enveloped in wider conditions of uncertainty that have shaped its development. In the sense that this is an enterprise founded on the idea of a knowledge deficit between so-called educators and emulators, Singapore actors are increasingly aware that they no longer have as much to share with the Chinese as they did a decade ago. For instance, in the earlier Suzhou project, and Chinese officials are, as they should, increasingly looking to sources of best practice in different parts of the world beyond Singapore. The Singapore state actors are aware of this closing window of time to engage China, and they are shifting their sights to other regional powers in Asia, namely India and its 100 Smart Cities project. Already, Singapore's urban planning agency and various planning companies involved in the Tianjin Eco-City have started participating in planning and developing India's grand plans of 100 smart cities, although the Singapore actors say that they will be lucky to get even 2 smart cities off the ground. So I want to end this with several questions for discussion. Cities have long been sites for the spatialization and enactment of projects of geopower, but the emergence of new cities in regions, such as the Eco-City, prompts us to consider city regional futures. And how does this push us to view what we know as the urban in a new light? And also, in this presentation, I focused on elites, but everyday people are also part of the futures of this Eco-City. So they become the subjects of the idea that social attitudes and mindsets can be altered and shaped by mobile technologies and governance to produce eco-citizens compliant with Singapore and Chinese ideals of sustainability. So the social sustainability dimension is quite interesting here. And with that, I will finish.